Thank you all so much for coming out to the Hot Docs at Home platform. My name is Will Denovi. I'm the Special Programs Curator here at Hot Docs, and I am delighted to welcome you all to this special bonus live Q&A with Dr. Peter Harris, who is leading our current Curious Minds speaker series on the age of reinvention. Peter, just a couple weeks ago, we launched all 6 lectures in his series. And I know from emails many of you have been sending in that quite a few of you have made some serious headway in getting through this exciting new series. So Peter and I are going to spend the next half hour or so running through some of those great questions that you've been sending to us. And providing a little more context on some of the key themes that he's been exploring in this series. If you haven't yet had the chance to finish all 6 lectures, don't sweat it. His lectures will be available on our platform to enjoy up until early October, and there'll be plenty of time to dig into them in more detail then. But in the meantime, we're delighted to have Peter with us to answer some of the great questions you've sent us so far in response to his new series on the age of reinvention. Please join me in giving Peter your warmest Curious Minds welcome.
Yes, thank you, Will.
Hello, Peter.
Hi, Will. Thank you for that warm introduction. And I can see little clapping hands floating through the ether here, I hope. Anyway, nice to be back on the screen with you. Thank you, Will.
Hello, Peter.
Hi, Will.
Hi, yes.
Thank you for that warm introduction. And I can see little clapping hands.
So folks, it seems that we're having a couple of technical difficulties. Peter and I are just a bit out of sync. We're going to get this ready to go momentarily. We're back. I'm getting the thumbs up. Peter, can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay, sorry about the little the choppy start there, but we're delighted as always to have you with us to run through some of the great questions folks have been sending to us in response to your Age of Reinvention series. The questions we received really span the full range of your series. So I think I'll go through them one by one, starting with the questions that came in response to your first lectures, and then we'll take it from there and work to go through go through the 6 lectures one by one.
Okay, sounds good.
But so we'll kick things off with your first lecture, number 1, New World Order, where we received lots of really good questions from our friends at home, wanting to know more about the Marshall Plan, that remarkable initiative that transformed post-war Europe. And specifically, folks wanted to know what was the effect of this very generous program from the US Treasury on America's national finances? Did these huge sums of money being used to aid the countries of Europe have any impact on the domestic finances of the United States?
Yeah, well, that's a good question, because you think, oh my God, the Marshall Plan, they're shoveling money into Europe as fast as they can print it. But it wasn't quite like that. They actually had a very ingenious way in which they handed out this money. And I'll try and describe it to you. But Will's going to mention, I think, a little later on, some of the resources I've suggested to him. And there's one called The Untold Story, the Marshall Plan, and it goes into detail about this. So let me just see if I can summarize that a little bit for you. So say that the Marshall Plan said to Italy, okay, you can have $1 million to buy tractors. Now, you and the committee, the Marshall Plan Committee, made up of Italian and American members, would decide how many tractors you needed, and America would then provide the tractors. They would arrive, they would be shipped on American ships to Italy, arrive and get not given, but sold by the Italian officials to those farmers who had requested a tractor. And then when the farmers paid back the tractor, that money then was kept by the Italian government and used for other purposes of reconstruction. So it was, I thought, a really interesting scheme to excuse me, to prevent the obvious notion of greedy officials pocketing all this money. They just couldn't do it. And so, yes, it cost money for the United States, but as you heard me say, they had to buy the tractors from the United States and they were shipped on American ships. So this was actually a boon for American post-war trading and manufacturing. Now, it wasn't the be-all and end-all of the European revival, but it certainly contributed considerably to it. And it was part of that amazing American post-war boom. Again, it not all, but because America was busy providing this huge pent-up market to all its 250 million citizens who hadn't been able to buy anything since about 1930 because of the Depression and then the war. So this wasn't the boondoggle and cash shoveling that some critics have made it out to be.
Right. So a great example of the American superpower really coming into its own in that post World War II period.
Yeah, well, you remember I played an example of Greece where they gave mules. Same thing. The farmers paid for those mules. I mean, minimal amounts, and then sometimes the Americans just gave them the goods like the mules and so on. But it was not being a swindle. It's quite a fascinating story. So for those of you interested in that cash flow situation, I heartily recommend that book I just mentioned, The Untold Story.
That's right. That's yes, The Untold Story. We'll be sending you, as Peter referenced, we'll be sending you a list of suggested further reading in a subsequent email. But the full title here is Saving a Continent, The Untold Story of the Marshall Plan by Charles L. Mee. And again, I'll send that to you in an email. But yeah, certainly fascinating material there, Peter. It's very common in contemporary politics in reference to pretty much any international crisis of the present moment for someone somewhere, some political pundit to say, oh, well, what we really need is a Marshall Plan for this, a Marshall Plan for the former Yugoslavia. We need a Marshall Plan for the coronavirus. This is a great example of the nuances that went into creating that sort of iconic, successful example of American foreign policy. So now moving on, Peter, we're gonna move on to the topic of the baby boom, which you covered extensively in lecture 2, and to a question from Curious Minds regular Roseanne Partington, who wanted to know what effect the post-war immigrants to the United States and Canada had on the baby boom. Did immigrants to larger cities end up taking up some of the inner city housing that was vacated by the flight to the suburbs?
Yeah, well, first of all, let me say hello, Roseanne. Always a treat to hear from you again. Which reminds me, by the way, I meant to send you an email thanking you for that picture of the subway station that indeed looks like a flying saucer. And I know just where you got that inspiration from. So much obliged for that. But to some extent, yes, the post-war immigration, especially from the countries that had really suffered in the war, Italy, Germany, to some extent, France, they came and took up some of the housing that was being vacated by people fleeing to the suburbs. And you might recollect that was a very white flight to the suburbs. Some of these immigrants stayed in that downtown or inner suburban area for a little while. And when they had sufficiently grounded themselves in the society, then they moved out and other people moved in. And I can actually give you a very specific example about Toronto. Now, my parents, both born in England, both immigrated between 1900 and World War I to East Toronto, met in a party function in Withrow Park. And that whole area of the Danny, as we call it, was heavily English, especially around St. Barnabas Church, where my parents were married. But there were English fish and chip shops and that sort of thing. And then after the war, it began to change as many of those immigrants now were growing after World War II, I should say. They were dying off or moving on to bigger and better housing, and a whole wave of Italians. And this is why I thought, Roseanne, you would be particularly interested in it. That area of the Danforth became heavily Italian for a while. Indeed, I remember one of my aunts saying when she came to visit us, by this time we had moved to Peterborough, "Oh, Dora, you wouldn't recognize the Danny anymore." She said, "It's all Italian." And then a pause and sort of puzzled looking. Nice people, though, because of course, this was the concept of the other, these were English immigrants. And so only English people were really proper. But yeah, it became very Italian. And then they moved out. And as we know now, it is very Greek. So this keeps happening. Areas keep rolling over, like the Roncesvalles. That used to be the German and Polish area. And the Germans integrated very quickly into Toronto society. And so there's almost no German traces left there, except that old Cafe Mai and the Revue Theater. The Revue used to show German films. And so that's the story of it rolling over and, different little Italies forming. I mean, I live just near St. Clair, and there's another little Italy there along the Via Italia. So it's a changing process, but yes, the waves of immigration were part of that increase in the population, along with the baby boom.
Okay, very, very interesting. Yeah, we don't always hear about that dimension of the baby boom, but that immigration did have a role in this
Right.
this widespread transformation of North American society and this suburbanization of American society, which you covered at some length in this series as well. So then moving on then again, Peter, into lecture 3, the Furious 50s. A lot of audience members wrote in with some great questions asking more about Harry Truman's move to desegregate the United States Armed Forces. They were curious to know whether this desegregation of the armed forces was a way to aid the buildup of the military. And then they were also curious to know more about Truman's personal feelings about this desegregation process. To what extent was this a politically motivated act? To what extent did it reflect any sort of deep-rooted personal convictions on his part?
Yeah, I found that also a really interesting question, and I was delighted to see it because I have to confess I'm a bit of a Harry Truman fan myself. And so I just want to read a couple of lines to you. He was very much in favor of that integration desegregation of the armed forces. And he just thought that this seemed proper. Truman brooked no nonsense. He was one of those don't tell me, show me sort of guys. A very famous anecdote I should mention, when he came to Potsdam because Roosevelt had died, and Molotov, the Mr. Niet, the Mr. No of Stalin's Russian regime at that point, was bad-mouthing him and talking about untrustworthy America. And Truman just told him, dressed him down, said, you keep your word, stop lying. And Molotov was quite taken aback and said, nobody has ever talked to me like that before. And Truman said, well, start keeping your word and nobody will talk to you like that again. I like that anecdote because it just indicates that he brooked no nonsense. And he felt that it just seemed totally just to integrate the armed forces. And so he had I'll just read it to you here. He wanted to bring it to Congress. So he tried that in February of 1948. He called on Congress to enact all of these recommendations about making the armed forces desegregated. Well, to nobody's surprise, all the Southern senators said, oh no, we're going to filibuster that. And so Truman, he used, and this is a process we're used to now, he did it by executive power, as a certain current president uses executive powers, only in my view, not to the same noble ends. And so he not only desegregated the military, but he bolstered the Civil Rights Division. He appointed the first African-American judge to the federal bench, and he named several other African-Americans to high-ranking administration positions. So it was July 26, 1948, when he issued that, in case anyone likes chapter and verse here, Executive Order 9981. There shall be equality of treatment and opportunity for all persons in the armed forces without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin. So he was very much the moral mover and shaker. This wasn't just a way to beef up the army or to cater to an interest group. This was his own moral crusade to have this happen. And he was also very supportive at this same time of Jackie Robinson breaking the color barrier in baseball.
Absolutely, yes. So a remarkable period for the start of the civil rights movement, but also, Peter, I think, as you're alluding to, and as you delved into a bit in your lectures, that these were important transformative policy changes, but then in turn transformed the political landscape of the United States. This is also the period where the Democratic Party started, Southern voters began to shift away from the Democratic Party in response to measures like this as well.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I mean, Truman knew that he was going to lose a considerable amount of the vote in the Southern caucus, but as he would have put it, possibly, Southern bigots be damned, full speed ahead with it. And I mentioned a Truman book, I think I did in that list, Will, about this period, Truman's memoirs, 46 to 1952. And
that's right.
I haven't read that in a little while, I have to confess, but I'm looking forward to getting back to it again.
Yes, again, we'll include that in our follow-up email as well. That's 1946 to 1952, Years of Trial and Hope, Memoirs, Volume 2 by Harry S. Truman. Moving on, Peter, to more American politics in the 1950s. Quite a few audience members wrote in with questions about the infamous Joseph McCarthy. I particularly liked a question we got from Jerry Rowan, who wanted to know if you could share more information on two of McCarthy's famous, or maybe we should say infamous, henchman lawyers, Richard Nixon and Roy Cohn. What can you tell us about them and the work that they did with Senator McCarthy?
Well, maybe I'll concentrate a little bit on Roy Cohn, because I'm going to assume that people know about Nixon's career. They may not know that before he got involved with McCarthy, he too was on the House Un-American Activities Committee, especially when it was active with the Hollywood 10 and so on back in 1947. But Roy Cohn, and then Nixon went on, as we know, he became president, Watergate, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think I'm, rather than cramp the time here, I'd like to talk a little bit more about Roy Cohn. And he became a lawyer and was one of the aggressive law team that was on the prosecution for the Rosenbergs, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, in 1950, who had been accused of stealing state secrets. They, well, it's a long story, but basically they were taking documents that Klaus Fuchs, another confessed Soviet spy, was stealing from the Manhattan Project and giving them to the Russians. And so Cohn was very intent on prosecuting them. And as we know, in retrospect, they both were executed at Sing Sing in 1950. And it's a pretty strong case against Julian Rosenberg, but at the time, and I must say still, some people claim that it was not nearly a strong enough case for the execution of Ethel Rosenberg. But Cohn was not one to shy from the limelight at this point in his career, certainly. And so she ended up, along with her husband, being executed in 1950. And it was that championing of that cause that drew him to McCarthy's attention. So he became a lawyer and confidant of McCarthy, because it was 1950 when McCarthy made that infamous comment to a West Virginia ladies club: "I have here a list of 250 card-carrying members." And that number kept shifting, of course, but people just latched right onto that because of the strong Red Scare element that had surfaced long before McCarthy. It was really there in 45, 46, and with HUAC and the Hollywood 10 in 1947. So McCarthy just was cashing in on a sort of flavor of the time. And Cohn became one of his close confidants. And we've seen some of the pictures of McCarthy and Cohn talking, you know, the averted hand sort of thing, for which he became known as a fixer, as somebody called him. And he then, when McCarthy's star set, McCarthy overreached himself in 1954 with those Army hearings. And I don't want to go into all that detail, but McCarthy lost his credibility and died in 1957, actually, as a hopeless alcoholic. But Cohn kept on going. And by this, then he became involved with somebody whose name might be familiar to you, a real estate wheeler and dealer from, I think it was Queens or the Bronx, I can't, one Donald Trump, whom Cohn began to nurture, so to speak. The thought of nurturing that person is, I must confess, is not an idea totally inimical to me, but there we are. He introduced Trump to the big time, the Big Apple, and then he became Trump's confidant. And he also, I don't want to go on forever about him, but he died in 1987 or 1988, I think, and he died of AIDS. And if you see some pictures of him at the time of his death, he's starting to show the ravages of the disease at that point through here. And I mean, a sad end, but the horror of it is that, of course, you couldn't come out and admit you were gay in the 50s. There was some sort of backroom talk about how that was Roy Cohn's situation. And indeed, in that whole Army McCarthy hearings, when Cohn tried to get some special treatment for, some say, one of his lovers, that was beginning to surface. But he just had a very long and, in my view, very nasty career. And I just mentioned that a new film has appeared about him. For those of you who want to pursue it, it's on HBO. I don't get HBO, so I haven't seen it myself yet, but it's called Bully, Coward, Victim. And the producer of that film, I don't know if you've shown that, Will, at Hot Docs, but the producer of that film is Ethel Rosenberg's granddaughter.
Wow.
So the wheel comes full circle.
Yes. Yes. No, I wanted to mention, so yes, that's a new Roy Cohn documentary that just got released this summer through HBO. There's also another excellent documentary about him that was released last year that we did show at Hot Docs called "Where's My Roy Cohn," which is, of course, a quoting an infamous line from Donald Trump, who famously said, "Where's my Roy Cohn?" when he needed a fixer to help him out in one of his many self-inflicted political crises of the last few years. But I can't recommend that film highly enough. It's by a documentary filmmaker named Matt Tiernauer, and it's called "Where's My Roy Cohn?" We screened it, we gave it a brief run last year here at the cinema, and you can now find it online at a number of places. But it's also a really excellent, very vivid portrait of this incredibly tortured man who had, through his affiliation with McCarthy, then later with Trump, and then with assorted figures in the Manhattan power structure, quite a large influence on American public life in the second half of the 20th century. Peter, just to wrap up on Joseph McCarthy, we had another interesting question from Curious Minds regular Stephen Lico, who wanted to know if Allen Ginsberg was ever investigated by the House Un-American Activities Committee or by Joseph McCarthy. Do you have any information there?
Yeah, I couldn't find a whole lot about that. He certainly was. It looks like it was the House Un-American Activities Committee. And because of course, Ginsberg was hardly subtle in his positions, right? He was gay. He praised some communist figures, etc. But I think HUAC investigated and thought, oh, it's just not worth the effort, you know. And by that point, of course, McCarthy's star was sinking rapidly because it was really 83, 84, 85 when Ginsberg began to surface with his connection with beat poetry and his performance of Howl and I showed a dramatization of that performance in one of the lectures. That by this time it's 1956. So I'm pretty certain that if he was investigated, not a whole lot was found, but he does get mentioned as one of the figures considered, and it would have been by HUAC.
Okay. I'm mindful of time here, Peter, so I think we'll move to some questions that we received in regards to your final lecture, a new era dawns, lecture number 6, where we received quite a few interesting inquiries about some of the great architectural innovations and developments that you explored. The people were particularly interested to know about sort of the current status of some of the great iconic buildings and designs that you profiled. So firstly, regarding the TD Center here in Toronto, after being in use for 50 plus years, how have these buildings weathered both physically and in the human usage of the buildings?
Well, the TD Center is held up extremely well, actually, and it's still very much in use. It has always had a very scrupulous maintenance system because Mies van der Rohe was very specific about what went where, down to the point of saying, this coffee table at the corner of the Barcelona sofa in the banking pavilion must have a red rhododendron on it, and this kind of thing. So they've just got used to keeping it up to a very high standard, and it's still in absolutely good nick. So it has held up quite well. Now, well, as has the Seagram Center. They've just redone a lot of that. Again, high quality maintenance on that.
And just to follow on that, Peter, we also got questions, one from again, other Curious Minds regular, Michelle Fiore, asking if you had any similar updates on the glass houses that you talked about from Philip Johnson and other architects. How have those?
Right.
The years?
Yeah, the glass house by Philip Johnson in Connecticut. That's also just undergone lots of renovations, and actually, it's not just that one glass house. It's a complex. There's something like 12 or 13 buildings on the site, and there's an underground library and a study where Johnson used to work, and of course the glass house itself, that one room famous glass house, was where Johnson and his partner David Whitney would have weekend parties, which were quite well known. The sort of glitterati of the New York scene would gather there. And about that building, well, the roof always leaked. It's a flat roof. And this seems to be a kind of syndrome of flat roof buildings. I know somebody asked Frank Lloyd Wright one time about why is it that the roof leaks in I think it was the Martin House in Buffalo. And he said, well, if the roof isn't leaking, you're not pushing the architecture far enough.
Right.
And even Mrs. Martin complained. She said, oh, Mr. Wright, it's leaking on my piano. And he said, move the piano. But just one last little story about the glass house. Apparently Frank Gehry and Johnson were talking at that glass house one time. And Gehry said, yeah, I've got one of my buildings and it's a 2-bucket roof leaker. And Philip Johnson said, oh yeah, well, this is a 4-bucket, one in each corner. So they never did completely solve it, and they had to shut off the heating system in the ceiling. And so they would crank up the heat built into the concrete floor, apparently so hot during the winter that you couldn't walk on it barefoot. But yeah, they have their challenges, these modern buildings.
Absolutely. Just hearing you tell that anecdote, it makes me think of the great European architect Le Corbusier, who you profiled in your wonderful last series for us, Age of Upheaval, who famously had a number of very innovative but very leaky houses that he designed for private clients as well. Maybe this is one of the sort of the metrics by which we have to judge true architectural innovation is how many buckets does your
Yeah,
roof produce?
that's right.
Um,
Sort of in the
so
same,
Peter,
like a
we're running out
three-dog
of time.
night, you know?
Absolutely. Peter, we're running out of time now, so I just want to close with a couple sort of couple interesting questions we got that I think will kind of sum up some of the fascinating themes you've been exploring in this series, and some of the big sort of takeaways we can derive from this fascinating 6-part journey you've taken us on in the post-war decades. Our audience member Candice wrote in to say that how much she enjoys the contemporary parallels that you draw in your lectures. And she wanted to know that, when you look at the material that you've covered over these 6 lectures, what would you say are the most significant lessons we can draw from the post-war years, either politically or culturally, that we can apply to the current pandemic we're living through and the process of getting our society here in Canada and around the world back up and running again? A tough question, I know, but I'd be interested to hear your thoughts.
Well, yeah, Candace, that's a wonderful question. And I've been mulling that. And as I was working through this, I'd think, oh my God, of course, you know. So one thing that I hope we are able to do is to restore some of this network of alliances that has been so badly damaged by the current administration in the White House. And I'm thinking quite specifically of NATO, but also of our own NAFTA or post-NAFTA, USMCA, or however we are supposed to say that. I mean, that is just dreadful, the kind of isolationist policies that have reared up with that administration. And I think we have to try and make sure that we restore some sense of order in international rule of law and of trade and of commerce, and particularly because some of the things I mentioned right in the first lecture are still very much a concern. We're still in the atomic era. The atomic treaty, or one of the atomic treaties, is being renegotiated right now. So we have to step back and to be able to say, we can't each be, making America, Canada, Russia great again, wearing these stupid red hats. We have to work towards some kind of universal sense of justice and order, like we see best, I think, at this point in the EU, even though it is severely strained too. So that's one thing. Another one is, I think we're going to have to look very seriously at urban redesign. People aren't going to be coming into their offices so much. Do we need such mass transit? What can we do about having regional centers and to break people from that really, I find, painful process of sitting in your car on the 401 or the 404 or whatever for up to 2 hours a day as you commute in and commute out. Do we need to do that? Is there a new kind of suburbia that we can come up with that is not the one whose faults we know so clearly now? Well, and of course, climate change, recycle, circular economy. I better stop, Will, or I'm going to run you way over time.
No, but those are great points to emphasize. I mean, it's certainly, I think, one of the takeaways we can take from your series is that the legacy of this post-war period, both politically and culturally, is still very much something we are living through today. In some ways, in many wonderful and positive ways, as you mentioned, Peter, there is that multilateral infrastructure of cooperations among nations, the United Formation of the NATO, that gives structure and stability to the world today and helps us weather the storm of things like this pandemic. But then, as you mentioned, there's also all these other areas in which the choices that were made in that era by governments around the world are having repercussions today that we're still having to resolve.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. So Peter, just to wrap things up, a fun question to serve as our finale this morning. Our audience member Laurel wrote in asking you to weigh in on what she said might be a silly question, but one that she greatly enjoyed hearing you answer in reference to your last Age of Upheaval series for us here at Curious Minds, which she and her husband attended and enjoyed. If you could invite any three historical figures from your Age of Reinvention series over for dinner, who would they be and why? And what would be served on the menu?
Well, I've probably given a strong hint of who one of them would be. I don't know whether you want to take a wild guess, Will.
Am I guessing a certain former president from the state of Missouri?
Yeah, you got it. Yeah,
Yes.
he's just a fascinating character. I'm going to slip in one quick thing about him that endears him to me. After he had finished as president, he and his wife Bess traveled across the United States in their modest car, and he paid by check everywhere he went because he knew no one would ever cash those checks because they'd keep it as a souvenir to have Harry Truman's signature.
Right.
Oh, I love that. So he would certainly be one. Another one that I think the research was being and the experience was accumulating during these 50s. She doesn't come to prominence until the early 60s, but it's happening in the 50s. It's a consequence of the Rosie the Riveter and the Suburban Housewife and so on. It's Betty Friedan. And challenging the role of women. I just found that to be so remarkable because we saw Rosie the Riveter, they didn't want to, not all wanted to go back to being housewives, which is a totally legitimate and difficult profession. But for everyone to be told that's all you can do is just so unjust. So that's why I think she would be great to have there. And I got, how many is it I can do?
You've got room for one more, Peter. One more seat at the table.
Well, another one which speaks to a concern of mine is the Silent Spring.
Rachel Carson.
Thank you. Rachel Carson, because she was accumulating that data about the effects of DDT at the same time that Betty Friedan was suffering through the straight-jacketed suburban housewife role. So I think the three of them would have a pretty feisty time. And I might see if I could get Jane Jacobs to maybe bring in the dishes so she could join in. Because she too was getting all her stuff lined up in the late 50s.
Right. And final point, because this was, I thought, a lovely tidbit in Laurel's question. What's on the menu, Peter? Would it be a classic 50s TV dinner? What would you serve to these illustrious guests?
It would be something very simple, like, because that was how Harry Truman's wife liked food. She was not a gourmand or part of the Washington glitterati. So it would be probably roast beef and mashed potatoes and green beans. Okay,
well, a fitting feast to cap off the 1950s and the post-war years. Peter, it is as always a delight to have you with us to shed some insight into the great material that you cover in your series with us. To our folks at home, thank you so much for tuning in today. Remember, as I flagged at the outset, you've got until early October to stream this series. So if you haven't finished the lectures, you've got plenty of time to do so. You've also got plenty of time to spread the word among other friends who I think who might enjoy the great material that Peter's been covering. And as Peter and I both mentioned, we will be sending you a follow-up email in which I will provide you all with both a recording of this Q&A that we're just completing now, as well as additional further reading and viewing suggestions, so you can dig a little deeper into the great topics that we've covered today and throughout this series. Peter Harris, it's always an honor and a privilege. Thank you so much for joining today, and we'll connect with you again soon.
Okay, thank you, Will. Always a privilege to talk with you. And thanks for all those good questions, everybody. Hope that we meet again soon. Bye now.
Bye for now, folks.